Interested in rodeo because of your dad's interest?
Well, because of his interest in horses, I was an instant horse nut, and I drove them absolutely crazy until they finally bought me my first old mare, and she was half Arab, half quarter horse. And in Salem at that time, they had what they called the Salem Saddle Club. And it was at the old fairgrounds there in Salem. They still have the old indoor arena, which is now an historical site. So I spent a lot of time there growing up, riding as many nights a week as we could. We lived in a little town of Brooks, Oregon, which was about 9 miles north of Salem. Mm-hmm. And from there, they had, well, at the fairgrounds, they had a roping club on Tuesday evenings and Sunday afternoons. They would rope for 2 hours on a Tuesday night, 3 hours on a Sunday afternoon, and some of the top RCA calf ropers from the Northwest, Louis Torsellis, there were some brothers named Pyatt, Jimmy Pyatt and his brother, and a lot of the top ropers would belong to that club. Well, that was my first and almost my last job. They hired me to push the calves up into the chute. And after a while, I realized that it was more fun to ride one while you're trying to herd the other ones up into the chute area there. And when they realized that they were not going to be able to threaten me bad enough to keep me off of them, they said, well, when we're through roping, you can ride a couple after we're finished with the practice session. So, of course, that was such an exciting thing for a young kid of...
How old were you, Larry, when that was going on?
I would have been, I believe I was about 11 years old then. Okay. And then in 1957, Weldon and Mom took me to my first kids' rodeo in Redmond, Oregon, and I won the calf riding, $6 and a belt buckle. And that was the beginning of my addiction to rodeo. I was 16 when I got on my first bull. I was trying to team rope by this time, and I entered the team roping with Bobby Christensen of Christensen Brothers at Lebanon, Oregon. And they had a couple of mount-out bulls, and I got on a bull each day, fell off. The next weekend, it was Cottage Grove, Oregon, and that's when they had just acquired a herd of rank young bulls that came out of Texas at that time, from Snowman, I believe it was Iceman. They had 8 or 10 really top bulls that went to the finals for quite a few years after that. And I remember at Lebanon that weekend, I got on probably 5 or 6 bulls. A lot of guys didn't show up, so I had a heyday there.
Oh, okay.
And each and every one of them threw me off. There was an old cowboy guy named Sterling Green who lived in Powell Butte, Oregon. Sterling roped left-handed. He rode bareback horses. He rode broncs. He had at one time ridden some bulls, but he was just an old all-around cowboy. And he was probably 28 or 30, but for a 16-year-old, that was an old cowboy back then. Mm-hmm. And Sterling from Lebanon said, why don't you come out to my place and we'll rope, and I have some colts that you can help me ride. And that was quite an experience. Sterling was one of those real characters.
He was probably one of your first mentors then.
He was. And Sterling is still alive. He lives on the reservation in Warm Springs, Oregon. And I saw him a few years ago. But this guy said, we're going to go to Klamath Falls, Oregon over the 4th of July. St. Paul and Molalla, Oregon were the big rodeos. Christensen Brothers, I believe, had maybe both of them at that time. And they also had Klamath Falls. But they didn't get many contestants down there. So I'll never forget when we left Powell Butte Sterling was one of those guys that would get up in the middle of the night and leave, and he had an old 1-ton truck with an old set of wood cattle rack on the back of it, and he loaded up a couple of horses in there, and we took off. And I remember we had to stop about every 100 miles and put about 3 or 4 quarts of oil in that old truck. And we pulled into a place between Redmond and Klamath Falls. I believe it was called Tule Marsh or something like that. And there was an old Native American Indian fellow named Ori Summers who raised bucking horses there. And Ori had raised war paint. That's where war paint came from. And Ori had wanted us to stop in on the way to Klamath Falls and help him gather some horses that he was going to take down there to try out. So I remember we pulled in there about daylight, had breakfast with him, and rode in some beautiful country and gathered up, I don't know, 15 or 20 head of horses out there in this one big trap that he had. So we took them to Klamath Falls, and I got on 4 or 5 of them. They didn't have many bareback riders or bronc riders, and I had been getting on some horses in the youth rodeos, junior rodeos up there. At that time it was the OWIJRA, Oregon, Washington, Idaho Junior Rodeo Association. So they said they wanted me to enter the bareback riding, the bronc riding, and I'd entered the team roping with Sterling and the bull riding. I didn't win anything in any of the events. In the first round, it was 2 go-arounds in the bull riding. I rode my first bull. Of course, I'll never forget, at that time a lot of the rodeo contractors had an old fighting bull called Tony Llama. Well, of course, being a nervous kid, first time to enter a bull riding, I drew Tony Llama. And I remember he was an old gray Bramer, and he ran out through there and stopped and was trying to hook the clowns, and the whistle blows, and I jump off, and they give me a re-ride. And I was excited that I just rode him and got away with my life. So my next bull was a big old nice bull called One Punch. I rode him, and then in the next go-around, I drew a bull that at one time had been a really nice, a relatively ranked little bull named Top Rail. And he'd slowed down by this time, and I rode him. I won the go-around and won the average, and $240 total. So when the rodeo was over, Sterling had a tendency to be broke most of the time, so he was having trouble paying all of the entry fees. And I remember the Christensen brothers, the secretary was reluctant to take a check on Sterling because I think she might have had 1 or 2 that she was already holding. And Sterling said, well, that he had me entered in the bull riding for a third of what I won. And I scratched my head and said, well, how'd you figure that? He said, well, you tried out the bucking horses. That paid your entry fees in those events. You were on the labor list. That paid your entry fees in the team roping. And I had you entered in the bull riding for a third of what you won. So I give Sterling $80. And we got out of town, got everything taken care of, and I think he's probably still owes them money, although they're no longer in existence. But he was quite a guy, and he helped me a lot. And he was a wild, wild west kind of a guy, born 100 years too late.
And you were 16.
I was 16.
So you were very impressionable.
I was very impressionable.